Welcome to Between the Cracks, the podcast where we have casual conversations around tea and teaware. My name is Dart, and today I have Derek with me.
Hey, what's up? I'm Derek from Tao Teaware and also from One River Tea.
Woo woo. Well, thanks for coming on, Derek.
my dear friend.
My dear friend, Derek Dearest. So today we're going to be talking about the most famous city for unglazed teaware, right? Which is Chaozhou?
Yixing, actually, yeah.
Oh, Yixing. Okay. Let's not get into the full deep end right away. We're not going to talk about clay to start, and we'll break that down in another episode or a later time. So, do you want to talk about our first trip to Yixing?
Oh yeah, that was fantastic. That was what, January of 2020?
Yeah. Was it 2020?
Is that right, or 2021? Oh, it was the end. It was the end of 2020. No, the beginning of 2021.
No, I think it was because we came home in March of 2021. It was right before we came home.
Yep. So yeah, it must have been January 2021. Yeah.
That's crazy, man. That's crazy.
So right after that, a lot of the COVID stuff, a lot of places were closing, and so maybe we didn't see an accurate representation. But I went there a few years ago with Paul, and it was equally as bad.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So let's talk about. Okay, let's first talk about how bad it was, just because I don't think people really understand. And honestly, it's not even that it was bad. It really sounds similar to, I don't remember what episode of Tea Soup you were talking about, but when you were talking about going to the tea markets, and you kind of had the same impression that we really got when we were in Yixing, looking back, retrospectively.
Yeah, so I guess the closest example I would have was when I went to Anxi. When I went to Anxi, it was just a quick 2-day layover between, Fuding and Chaozhou.
Yeah.
I was getting the white tea, and I was then going down south to get some Dansong oolong. And I was like, in the way I can stop by Anxi and see what it's like. And I get to Anxi, and it's just like a really small province, and a lot of the stuff is happening outside of Anxi in the smaller villages. Yeah. And I go to their wholesale market, and it's just like massive amounts of tea for a couple kwai, 20 kwai, tea that's like $3 a pound, $2 a pound, 50 cents a pound, and whatever you want, you can get for whatever price. And it's there were no, I didn't see in that area at least, no excellent tea masters that are like, yes, this is the finest tea I've ever made in my life. And so you see this different kind of wholesale idea there. And Yixing reminded me a lot of that, about that, where it had this history, a long history, and it was just kind of riding that momentum. And there's not a lot of new innovations. In fact, a lot of the only new innovations we saw when we were there, and you can attest to this, is the ways to make traditional shapes and colors on the fly, on the cheap, with modern technology. And I'm thinking of the blue and the green clays right there.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I would like to say I don't think that's true for everywhere in Yixing, but we're specifically talking about the market, right? Like going to the Zisha, I forget what the exact name was.
I think it was Dingshan Spoon.
Okay, yeah. So going specifically to the market, I mean, we went to, what is it, 100 to 200 studios in that little
I don't think that many, but there are that many, but we didn't go to all of them. Yeah.
No. Yeah, we didn't go in everyone. Yeah, but the point is, it's a block of a small block, right? Of these just different alleys, and every single little shop was a different shop with teaware. And we didn't really see any of the innovation. And like you said, it was just riding the coattails kind of the history. But I think you also have to remember that Yixing is also extremely famous in China, right? And when we go places, right, as Americans, as Westerners, where do we go? We go to Disney World, right? If you're Chinese and you're traveling, you have to bring gifts home, not just for your kids, but your coworkers, your friends. And so there is this expectation, if you're going to Yixing, you're probably going to pick up 10 to 20 teapots. And so, I mean, are you really going to get that nice of teapots? Because they can get expensive.
Right. And so, we saw a lot of specialty shops, Techan shops and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think one interesting parallel that we could draw for Yixing is it's kind of like a gold mine town, or a coal mining town where all the coal is dried up and all the gold is gone.
Yeah.
This is interesting too, because, you know, like the Yixing clay is supposedly all mined up and all hoarded. And so they're just like, they're kind of existing in this place where there is no new material around. And it's just this kind of like, oh, I want to say like a ghost town. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, but let's talk about some of the good. Let's talk about some of the good, because we've talked about like they're riding the coattails of that history. But some things that I really like are how the shapes and styles in Yixing are now being like they're evolving and changing, and they're a placeholder, a history point for people in other cities. Because I think that's one thing that we really don't have here in like the American small teapot scene. Like there's no codex, right? Like there's no teapots to go look back to. And I really appreciate that, like, if we go anywhere, right? If we go to Chaozhou, if we go to Qinzhou, if we go to Jianshui, right? We can get a Shishi, we can get a Shipiao, we can get a Shuiping. And they may be the exact same, which honestly I don't really like as much, or they may be like, you know, like these pots, right? Our new pots from Qinzhou, where this is technically a Shipiao, but it's very different. Like there are characteristics that are very different than a classic Shipiao. This would be triangular, not rounded. There would be 3 feet on the bottom, which honestly, I love the fact that we have this this burnished lighter color and then the darker color on the bottom. But like, that's one thing I noticed with these American potters that I'm talking to is they don't have this reference point.
I mean, yeah, for what it's worth, though, like China has been, Yixing in particular, has been making teaware for how long? Do you have the number on that?
I mean, so you could say back as 700-800 years, but realistically, I think very much like much of modern, the roots of modern tea culture, it goes back to Zhu Yuanzhang saying, "Hey, loose leaf only in the Ming Dynasty." But again, that was the start, right? That was, I mean, that's 400 years before.
Yeah.
Yeah, before Chaozhou really started to do Gongfu tea, right? Before we had small teapots, which even we really didn't see that many of in Yixing. So it's not really what we think of as Yixing today, but I would say that's probably the furthest back we can go and say they really got to a point of maturity in their ceramics about 500 years ago.
About 500 years ago. And then how long have American potters been making pottery? Sorry about that one. I just mean like, so
1770.
So of course there are America's, you know, an incredible melting pot for a lot of different cultures, a lot of different artistic techniques. And one of the great virtues of America is being so open-minded to all of these new influences, where China can be very close-minded and very traditional. However, there's virtues in both of these, because when China has a specific region with a specific type of tea or a specific type of clay or style of teapot, they double down on that, and they really, really get good at making that particular. I keep wanting to say like the daibiao, like the product for export. Like this is the characteristic teapot of this region, and so we can kind of see, like you said, there is this natural codex that arises where these are the teapot shapes from this area, from this time.
Yeah.
Where America, it's just a little too chaotic, a little too modern to really have, I'd say.
And I think a lot of it goes back to the communal versus individualistic culture as well, right? Like when we think about American potters, or just, you know, American craftsmen and artists in general. Yeah, it's individualist. It's how am I different than everyone else, which isn't a problem. It's not a bad thing, but it's harder to put people in a box because of that, unless they reach, like, you know, really, really high heights of famedom.
So also let's back up a little bit and talk about what makes Yixing unique in the way they're making their teapots.
Yeah.
Right? That's the common term you'll hear is the slab built. Do you want to explain slab built?
Yeah, sure. So most pottery that for teaware and other dishware, let's say, is made on a wheel. Right. So you take a slab of clay and the wheel, the centripetal force from the wheel pulls all this clay together. And what you do is you basically, you separate it, right? You pull it apart, not literally just straight out. First, you cone it, shape it, center it. Then you bring up the walls, then you start to shape it. But it's this force that pulls the clay apart. And so just in the fact that in the way that you're using the wheel, you're making the clay more porous because you're pulling it away, right? The difference with Yixing clay is they're sitting with a manual wheel that they move their hand to spin the wheel, and they're using a combination. A lot of them will say over 100 different tools. I think that's a little bit dramatic. Most of them, probably are using 10 to 20 regularly, and they have their full shelf of different things. But they're patting the clay together. And so what this does is it compacts the clay. When you're compacting it, as opposed to pulling it apart, you have more ability to fire at different temperatures. And so it gives you an ability to create a more dynamic clay, or use the clay more dynamically. Whereas when you're throwing on a wheel, it's finite. Because you're making it thinner, you're making it weaker when you're throwing it. Whereas Yixing, you can actually be making it stronger in the making of the pot. In addition to that, it's extremely labor intensive. The amount of time that it takes to make an Yixing pot, you have to create the slabs, you have to put the slabs together. Whereas when you're throwing on a wheel, talk to most potters, they can throw the body of a pot very quickly, and the spout and the handle and the lid is really what takes the time. But even with an Yixing clay, putting the shaping the body takes a long time, because it's just pat, 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 pat with this wooden tool over and over and over again to get this shape.
Yeah, and then comes, as you mentioned, the assemblage, where it's like, okay, now you have, flat slabs of clay. Now you want to mold them, shape them, attach them. And once you do that, as we know with a lot of other, potters and stuff like that, you have that drying phase where it's like, okay, if I attach this part, now I have to like dry and let it kind of come together before I can shape it a little more, before I can, trim it and stuff. And one unique thing about this, since you're not using that centripetal force of the wheel that's creating that nice circular motion, you can create angular shapes. And so one of the really characteristic things of Yixing are seeing these hexagonal teapots, these pumpkin-shaped teapots, which I hate, which are not useful.
Whose pumpkins look absolutely amazing?
Whose?
Mark's.
Oh.
No, Mark's. But it's because of the clay. The clay looks more raw, and so the pumpkin looks more raw, so it looks more like an actual pumpkin. Yixing, the clay is so pure and clean because they put so much into it that it just looks unnatural. Like, it doesn't look, I don't know, it doesn't look right. I don't like it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't like a lot of the angular shape things, just because it doesn't seem like it's the best shape for brewing tea. Like, if you're thinking like, okay, like how can I get the water into here and the water out of here in the best, most efficient way? It's probably a sphere. Yeah,
for sure. Mary has this really cool, it's like a lotus shape. Well, it's like a lotus. It looks like it's like lotus pressed. I don't know.
Is it a Buddha hand?
No. It's anyway. It's similar to the shape of like a gourd that has some kind of contour, and it looks like it has like the outline of the lotus pressed on the outside. I need to look at the pot again, honestly. But it was a really, really unique shape that had to be put together by hand, but it still kind of kept the basic shape of having like a circular base. It was slightly wider, so it wasn't a complete circle. It was more like an oval. And then it kind of just came up to a rounding point at the top. So it had this kind of dynamic interestingness that you really couldn't get on a wheel unless you really spent a lot of work after kind of recreating, which really wouldn't be worth it. But again, I think to your point, like, if it loses the functionality, and honestly, most of the fruits at this point, I don't really like the fruits, the vegetables, the gourds, the bamboo, the dragons, like, they're overproduced in mold made pots. And so honestly, I look at them like, yeah, like, even if they're nice, I don't know.
Now, you mentioned something that I want to kind of dig into right there, mold made pots. And so here's a really cool thing, because real Yixing teapots are incredibly labor intensive, because you have to pad out every side of everything, every angle, attach it and stuff like that. A shortcut to that is to create a mold and then just, fill it full of, wet clay and then let that dry out. And the idea of mold making teapots, it's not a brand new technology. Like, China was mold making swords, bronze swords, in like the Han Dynasty, like BC. And so the idea of molds is not new to them. They're just like, oh, how can we streamline this? Because we have, a large people, so many people want these, so we'll just maximize how we make them. And so I have a feeling, I haven't done any research, but it's I heard a good term, Idiothopus. It's an idiotic hypothesis, which is it's not a real hypothesis, just an idea that's worth considering. It's from David Eagleman.
Okay.
He was on the Tim Ferriss podcast,
I love my boy Tim.
Idiothopus is that, you know, mold making Yixing teapots has been around since Yixing teapots have been being made, but I'd like to do some research into that.
My idiothesis is it probably wasn't the time that we referenced in the earlier. I think it was probably a couple hundred years later, because like I think it just started to pick up in the Ming Dynasty. So I'm sure that like for most people, it was probably still, it was just for the aristocracy to kind of flex. And for the common person, it probably still wasn't, I don't know. But again, it really could go either way. Like I could see like people locally at least starting to mold make things, right? Because they're like, well, hey, the aristocrats have it, like let's have something cool too. But I could also see it have been like a couple hundred years later. But honestly, yeah, it's my Idiocritus as well. I don't know. Just my speculation.
Cool. And so, yeah, like when we were in Yixing, we saw people doing the live stream and hand making the pieces on the wheel, patting it down, cutting it. In the same studio, I remember seeing a bunch of molds. And I remember some people saying like, yeah, like we do half mold, half handmade. So we'll do the mold and then we'll kind of fix it on here and show everyone how we're fixing it.
So that's an important, like, that's a really important distinction, because a mold made teapot is a lower quality clay. Now, clay in and of itself, there's not good clay and bad clay. Okay. I think that's something that people like. If you refine clay, you can get any clay to be better. I mean, there's clays that fire to different temperatures and like that can change. But like, if you work with the clay, you can make clay good if you pay attention to it and let it lead you, rather than you try and like put your expectation on it for how to fire it. But the reason that mold made pots are lower quality clay is because they add water, and that water dilutes it in the same way that throwing on a wheel, right? That lowers the quality. But don't get me wrong here. A wheel thrown pot is structurally still much stronger than a mold made pot. And both of them are more than capable of brewing tea for a lifetime. Okay, so unless you're firing wrong, if you have a mold made pot, a half hand, or a full handmade teapot, they're all going to be fine for the whole life of you brewing them. It's really just if they're fired incorrectly for what that clay is that you'd have an issue. So going back to the point though about the mold made versus half mold, or half hand, excuse me. The half hand is used for shaping, whereas the full mold made is literally like shoot clay schlop into mold and then pull it out. And so that's really the difference. Is used for shaping, or literally the whole entire thing is crafted by the mold.
Yeah, but I was waiting for you to use the word slop. Happy it happened. And so when we were in Yixing, we saw a lot of schlop teapots, a lot of really low quality stuff.
Yeah, a lot of
the green clay, the blue clay, the really ugly clay, the stuff that lids don't fit. You could see the seams and everything. And so it's like,
oh, like this terrible one I have over here.
Oh no. Yep. And so this brings up a really good thing about sourcing. Yeah, it's like that pot was a switcheroo.
Yeah,
it was a switcheroo from a guy.
Oh, you can't see the inside to see it. It's gross.
Yeah, so the story behind that is I source everything here, and I bought 2 pots from this guy. I think that's from a Chaozhou guy. Yeah, and he sent me the 2 pots, and they look good. And I was like, okay, give me 10 more. And he's like, I don't have stock. Can I replace them with this other one? It's slightly larger, I believe. Or slightly smaller, slightly larger.
Yeah,
maybe,
larger.
Like 140 millimeters. And I was like, yeah, sure, if it's the same quality. And it was not. No. It was not the same quality.
First one was like decent mold made. Second one was like, I wouldn't, yeah.
And so a really interesting thing is, you can go to Yixing itself, the city where all of these teapots are from, and you can buy a terrible Yixing teapot.
For sure.
It's just going there is not enough.
But again, like there is no such thing as fake Zuni and real Zuni, fake Junie and real Junie. Like Zini literally just means purple clay, and I think sometimes people mean it to mean a specific clay from a specific mine. From that's not the case. That's not the case. And I wish the answer was that simple, and we don't have enough time to cover it in this podcast. But like, they are names for groups of clays that have similar effects. It is not referring to one single clay, unless you get into very, very specific pots, in which case it will say which mine it is from. Who like and those are extremely expensive, and no one, I would say most tea and teaware vendors are not selling these pots unless they exclusively sell these in a boutique collection, and like that's all they do.
Like auction level stuff,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Like that, the terminology just gets so crazy, because I remember in Chaozhou it's like, oh, we do Juni, and I'm like, okay, like tell me about Juni, and they're like, well, Juni is part of Zuni, and I'm like, oh, so it's Zuni, and they're like, well, it's kind of in the category of, and I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah. So the overarching term is the zisha, right? The
zisha, that's right.
Purple sand, right? And then under them, you'd have the zini, the duani, and the juni, which is purple mixed, and then a cinnabar color, respectively. But again, like it gets really weird, because the duani is a mixed clay, right? Like, so they use duani. They cut, if they're gonna make any color, it's usually some combination of duani, right? But a pure duani, and this honestly I'm not sure about, but I am curious. I have seen the white duani, and I think it's fired at a different temperature, which is why it's white instead of yellow. But it could just be a completely different ore, and I'm honestly not sure. I'm not sure, but it really could be fired at a different temperature, or just a different type of clay. But the rabbit hole is so deep, and people get so hung up on like, is this real? Well, is it clay? Is it a teapot made by an artist? Is it handmade or half handmade? Because if it is, that's a real teapot, regardless of like your expectation for what the clay is or should be.
Right. And so I think now's a good time to kind of talk about the better things that, maybe you didn't see, but I saw in my previous visit is in the wholesale town, in the Dingshan town, you see a lot of these big stores, and they're just selling a bunch of teapots, Really, you can see really low quality, sometimes some nicer quality, but usually it's kind of a risk to buy anything from those people. I ran into a guy who was at one of the places talking to his friend, and he was actually a maker, a younger teapot maker, and he took me to his studio. And then his studio is kind of off the main drag in a old kind of building. We get up there, and that's where I see all of his clay, his really nice teapots. The stuff he says it takes him 3 weeks to bring a teapot to completion, just because he spends so long kind of clay conditioning it after he does each step. And so he takes me to his place, and I see the full workshop, all of his tools and everything. I'm like, okay, like the real artisans are still here in this city. But he is also, it seemed like he was so bored out of his mind, like, because there's just nothing going on in Yixing. And he was doing calligraphy. He was doing like the pipa, the arhu, and he was doing like teapots and stuff like that. But I just got this sense of kind of like, kind of a little bit of loneliness, like not really like the complete joy of like, this is where I belong. But he was making some really great teapots, I guess.
I mean, Yixing's a pretty small place. At least it felt like it. Like when we it wasn't the, I don't know, like, I would have, like, honestly, I would have thought it was bigger, because we're also still in, like, we're still in Jiangsu, right? Like,
right.
I mean, we're talking about the
Jiangsu's pretty affluent,
yeah, right. One of the two, most affluent provinces in China, right?
The wealthiest by GDP, I believe.
Yeah. So like, I don't know, that's China though, right? Like, just because you're right next to Shanghai doesn't mean the city or town right next door isn't still living in concrete buildings with no insulation, right? Like that's
and as is my want to give a little geographical layabout of the area. If you can look at Shanghai on the map, and then you go east, you'll hit Suzhou, and then you hit that big lake Tai. And then if you go north around the lake, you'll hit Wuxi, and then you keep going kind of like to 11 o'clock. Then that's Yixing. And then if you actually go a little further down to like what would that be, 7, 8 o'clock? That's kind of Anji, if you know Anji Baicha. You get to the Zhejiang area.
Oh
and
my
then
goodness.
south of there is pretty far south. Then you'll get to Hangzhou.
Do you know how many Chinese people, when I tell them I like tea, like, well, you know that you know Anji Baicha, right? You know Anji Baicha. I'm just like, oh my goodness. Yes, I know. Do you want to tell everyone if they don't know, Derek, what we're
really
talking about?
Yeah, I don't really care about Anji Baicha. I've never really sourced it. Anji, the actual core region of it, is incredibly small. And so a lot of the Anji Baicha on the market is fake. And then a lot of the real stuff is incredibly expensive, like as expensive as the really nice Dragon Well or Bilo Trin, because it has a really high domestic market in China. But in the West, people don't really, want to empty their pockets for Anji Baicha. They want a nice high quality tea, but likely it's not from the core region. So for me, I've never really sourced it. But I think what Dart's mentioning here is the fact that literally in the name, Anji is the region, and then Baicha means white tea. This is not a white tea. This is a green tea in its production style. And so you'll get into a small argument with some Chinese people. They're like, oh, you like tea? What about Anji Baicha? You're like, oh, Anji Baicha is a really good green tea. And they're like, oh, baby, it's a white tea. It says Baicha. Anji Baicha. Baicha means white tea. And you're like, yes, but it's actually a green tea. It's not sun-dried. And they're like, but I don't know if you know the Chinese of Baicha and the meaning. And you're like, okay. Not sure if I can continue this conversation.
It's funny. It's funny. But
anyways, like, what about did you get any impressions from Chinese people about Yixing? Because I found out a lot of Chinese people, they don't know where Yixing is. And so I tell people, it's like, oh, it's in Jiangsu. And like the Jiangsu people are like, really? Wow, that's cool. And I'm like, could be a geography thing. They're not really, they don't focus on it too much, but.
I feel like I didn't have, like, if I mentioned Yixing, people knew what I was talking about for sure. I don't know. I feel like I didn't really get into that. I mean, I was only there for like a week or two after we went to Yixing. Like that was my last trip before we came home. So like there were really only a handful of people I saw. Robin and Rainbow, it was Robin's dad, actually gave me an Yixing pot. Yeah, he gave me an Yixing pot. Like we went to like the dinner at their house, like it's kind of like our farewell dinner. And he gave me an Yixing pot. It was it was cool. It was a really cool experience for him to give it to me. I mean, it wasn't like a super nice Yixing pot, but it was like he just knew I was into tea, and it was kind of a sweet final gesture. It was a like 250 ml shisha. It was like a Junie, or it looked like a Junie pot. Yeah. So, but he was really the only one that really knew. Rainbow and Robin are in their 20s, and they didn't really know anything about Yixing. I'm trying to think of other people that I talked to that week or two that we came back before we left. But
my general reaction was I told people I was going to Yixing, and they're like, wow, that's so far away. I'm like, no, it's not. It's like a 2-hour bus ride. And they're like,
well,
really?
that's because you can't just take the Gaotie.
Yeah, you can't take the high-speed rail.
Yeah, you have to get on the bus, and then you have to like there, but honestly, the breakfast, like, oh wait, no, that was at the bamboo forest right after we went to Yixing. Rachel and I went to the bamboo forest. We just had this like,
which is right nearby.
Just like, yeah. Oh yeah. Seriously, if you ever had the opportunity to go to Yixing, the bamboo forest it's one of those places from like a dreamscape, a Chinese movie. Like it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Right. So there are a few cities in the area. There's Suzhou, Changzhou, Wuxi, and then Wuxi has like a few like sub-districts. Like one of them is Yixing. Another one would be the Liyang, and I think Liyang has the bamboo forest, the Nashan bamboo forest. And it's just beautiful. There are hot springs out there, and that's a nice destination. Yixing, it's like, I tell people I'm going to Yixing, and they're like, the first question is why? And I'm like, for the teapots. And they're like, oh, okay, for the teapots, but you don't need a lot of time out there, I don't think.
Yeah.
Last thing, you hit on a interesting point where it's like, we get out there and all the teapots, almost all of the teapots, I'd say 85-90% of them are 200 milliliters or more, right?
Yeah.
And so they're just making large teapots, and this is the classic style. And so I think as we kind of, as I mentioned in an episode in Tea Soup about the creation of the Chinese tea culture, they kind of imported or exported the Chaozhou small brewing vessels, the small gaiwans, about 100 milliliters, and the smaller teapots from Chaozhou around like the 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a modern innovation to be brewing in these smaller vessels. And so usually, traditionally, you would have 200 milliliters, 200 plus milliliters for your teapots.
You know what's one thing I'm kind of curious about, because I don't know if you remember that reel, but it was the reel where I was like, stop asking for tiny teapots. And there were a lot of people who were like, well, you know, like I love my tiny teapot. And I'm like, you know, that's fair. But I'm curious why Factory One was making small teapots. And again, this is, I don't remember the term you said. What is it? The not guess hypothesis, the
idiotic hypothesis. Idiothesis.
Idiothesis. Okay. So my idiothesis for why Factory One was doing those smaller pots is because they were less clay.
Interesting.
But I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just like why, what was the, because that change, that was before Chaozhou, right? That was before Chaozhou had, you know, that culture had moved over. And like, do you really think like 90 years ago that there was that connection, like a strong connection between Chaozhou and Yixing tea culture? I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's something that there's got to be a lot of research on. There's got to be like a full catalog list and percentages and numbers of the types of shapes they were making at that time, how many of this teapot they made. And then we could do some, you know, analysis on the data and be like, okay, like how many Factory One teapots are out there? Like how many of this size, of this shape, of whatnot? And that's something maybe I could ask Alex, because Alex is pretty well versed in academic China, if there are any research papers on Factory One in the area.
That would be, I think that's a cool follow-up for some time in the future. Talk to Alex about and kind of come back to Yixing, because honestly, after this, I think we've both been really excited about other areas, and Yixing has kind of been one of those places that like everyone knows about, but again, it's kind of like you said in the beginning, it's riding the wave of its fame, and there's so many more interesting things happening in all the other ceramic hubs.
We can talk about this in another episode, but like I have been to Jingdezhen three times now, and it's so much cooler than Yixing. like I could just objectively say it is cooler, like without making any like, oh well, maybe it's my opinion. Like no, like there's so much more modern development, creativity, young people flocking to Jingdezhen, and Yixing, everyone is leaving. Like we saw, you know, like the two old couple, the old couple with their daughter who makes really great teapots, but she doesn't live in Yixing. Like,
I didn't really connect those dots until you just said that, but there was kind of a sadness, a somberness to some of the people in Yixing with that. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. That Jade. I don't. Do you remember that Jade guy that I talked to for like 5 days?
Nope.
No. I sat. There's a Jade market in Yangzhou, and I just hung out with this dude, and he just talked to me about Jade for like 5 days. But he was like, you know, just talking about how he's not passing it on to his kids because the jade has become so expensive, and, you know, just not even really the cost of living, really just the fact that the cost of the jade has become so much more, that the margin is so much lower, that he didn't teach the craft to his kids to pass on because it doesn't make sense. And, you know, the pricing on Yixing clay and Yixing pots and the quality that you're getting versus some of the other regions, it's just like, it doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't make sense in modern day times to really be still doing Yixing pots.
Here's a really polarizing connection, something we could discuss later. The advent of AI art and traditional art, and the idea of mold-made teapots and traditional teapots, and you know, at what point does one replace the other because of value, time, and energy, like, and overall performance?
That is a great question for a further video. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode of Between the Cracks. You'll be seeing much more of Derek and I and many other co-guests as we progress with this podcast. So thanks for hanging out today, Derek. I see you every day, so every week. So
of course, if you guys are interested in more tea specific content, check out my podcast, Tea Soup. This is through the One River Tea. as we mentioned earlier, I have the One River Tea where I source and sell Chinese tea. And then this is Tao Teaware where we do all of the teaware and the history and dig in deeps into all these different regions. So if you're interested in tea specific sourcing, check out the Tea Soup podcast. Should be available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Peace.
Later, guys.